Hello and welcome to Misplaced Musings, the 1990 edition. Well, part one or part something. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Cowan. I'm joined by,
Shannon Duffy.
hey, Shannon. And what are we doing today? I
Well,
mean,
today,
1990, obviously, but
yes, we're talking about the year 1990 in video games. What started off as us just looking at what won game of the year and what we were going to talk about there turned into a giant undertaking because we don't know how to stop. And we're just going to go over video gaming in 1990. Now, I want to preface this. We have done research and we looked into it quite a bit, but we are not experts. And we have very narrow things that we like that we are very knowledgeable about, which means we're going to miss a couple things.
I
And
love your
that's
disclaimer. I love it. It's basically like, hey, man, we're gonna suck, but but yeah,
oh, we may not suck, but we might not get that one weird Ultima offshoot that five people played. All right, it's just
I mean, yeah, we're not covering every game.
yeah.
Also, this first episode is only looking at consoles and home consoles and handhelds, and mainly in North America. We're gonna do a at least a second parter that looks more at like PC and Japanese computers and stuff like that. But that one's gonna take a lot more research, so that's a second episode.
Yeah, considering we're both in the United States and that's where a lot of our knowledge base is, this will be the easier way to start it off. So, to get right into it, before we dig into gaming and such as a whole, why don't we talk about a few fun things that happened in 1990 in general?
There were fun things in 1990.
I don't know. I was a year old.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was a pretty small kid. Actually, I mean, I guess that is the year that I got my NES. So that's
The most.
1990 is the year that gaming began for Brian.
There you go. That's very important.
But as far as what was happening in the world, it was the you know President George H.W. Bush was president. It was the beginnings of like the stuff that would become the Persian Gulf War. I believe that was the year that Germany was reunified. Uh, Looks like the Hubble telescope was launched. The I had another the some of the top movies that year were the Total Recall, Goodfellas, Misery, Die Hard 2, Die Harder,
Such a good name.
yeah, Home Alone, and Edward Scissorhands.
And Kindergarten Cop. Can't forget Kindergarten Cop.
Oh yeah, yeah. And yeah, it was a interesting, transitionary year. I wish I had been older so I could appreciate it more because it seems like there was a lot going on as far as like changes in culture and big significant events. It was like very early versions of the internet and things like that were coming along. There were big strides in like medicine and of course huge political shifts in the world.
Yeah, 1990 was a large year. And a couple of the things that I looked at, one of the top shows of the time was still Cheers.
Hell
And
yeah.
yeah, and for sports ball, World Series, that's baseball, right? Yeah, World Series is baseball. The
Sports
Cincinnati,
ball.
the Cincinnati Reds, the Super Bowl champions were the San Francisco 49ers. The
Ugh.
NVGA champions were the Detroit Pistons. There we go. There are other ones, but I don't care about those sports at all. I didn't even care about the ones that I talked about. But those things happened in 1990. But let's kick off the year looking at CES. And what exactly is CES, Brian?
The Consumer Electronics Show. It's a trade show convention thing that happens every year. It happened this year. It was a very cool year this year, actually. But I love how I say it happens every year, and then I'm like, and it happened this year. But no, it's basically where all the tech companies will show off like their new products. And this was, before all the conventions that we have now, like E3 and PAX and things like that. So it was, a big place for the video game companies to show off their new and upcoming things because they didn't really have a better place to do it yet.
Yeah, exactly. And to kick off in the winter show, which happened in January, Nintendo had some really big announcements. One of those big announcements was Mario 3. Super Mario Brothers 3 was coming to the NES in March that year. It was
That's the
fine.
that's the North American version, right? Like, cause
Yes.
yeah, because I was gonna say the Japanese version had been out for a little while because this was before parody, where things release at the same time like they do now.
Exactly.
Most people know that back then, anybody who lived through it knows that Japan would get things months, sometimes years
Years,
before
yeah.
we did. Yeah, and it worked the other way around too. There's a lot of Western developed games that just never came out in Japan.
Or if
Like,
they did, it was a lot later than we got them.
yeah,
So, yeah, no, absolutely. And that's what made the announcement such a big deal because people were waiting for a long time for Super Mario Brothers 3. And then we finally got the hard release date, that CES, and people got really excited. And a couple
yeah.
other oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just gonna say it had been teased forever in like Nintendo
Mhm.
Power and stuff, with little snippets saying like, "Here's Super Mario Brothers 3, and it'll come at some point."
Yes. And something else that came out that was a big deal and ended up being a very big deal for people like us who are into RPGs is Nintendo announced Final Fantasy to come out in 1990 at that show.
Nice.
Yeah, something that helped determine the genre for a very long time.
For some
And
angry people, they'll say it was the beginning of the end for RPGs.
oh my gosh. Um, those same people probably also don't like Star Tropics, which was announced, and I love Star Tropics. Um,
No one loves Star Tropics.
I love Star Tropics, and then back from the year before it was Pinbot, a new pinball game for the NES, which is actually pretty cool. Pinbot was pretty neat. And then they had a lot of peripherals coming out for the NES. So a lot of different things like
It is
a
just
multi tap.
I was
Oh,
just gonna say, just to kind of set the how weird this year is, because
mhm,
this is the NES has been out, what, like, if you count the Famicom, it's been out since like 84 or
mhm,
85. So it's old.
yes.
The Sega Genesis is already on the market. So is the TurboGrafx 16. The
Mhm.
TurboGrafx CD is already on the market. Uh, this, the Super Famicom's not here yet, but it is just so weird that they're like, Nintendo's like, here's our new biggest things of the year for our like 6-year old system.
Hey, it was
Um,
a huge deal. Everybody had one. It was the NES was a huge success.
it just must
So
have been. I can imagine. I had a Sega Genesis eventually, and I loved it. But I imagine at this point, like, just if you were still playing on NES and you saw a Sega Genesis, like, that gap in uh like graphical fidelity just had to be mind blowing.
probably, yeah, no, for sure. And also some of these peripherals that I was talking about, right?
Before I interrupted
They,
you and stole the show, yeah.
yeah, you're totally fine. They did things like add 4-player functionality, which didn't come until the 64 as like a base thing for most consoles. And Nintendo was one of the first ones to really put that out there. And it was like a 25, no, $40. Yeah, so it was a $25 peripheral with a
That
$40,
worked for like 2 games.
yeah, with a $40 attachment that would let you put up to 15 more feet so you could play. It was interesting the times back then. But to jump over to the other side, you were bringing up the uh the Sega stuff. And this was right after the Mega Drive came out. And that
I'm
was a
sorry,
big
the
part.
Sega Genesis, you mean?
Yeah, no, for us in America, the Sega Genesis, but I also grew up in Europe, so I call it the Mega Drive.
Gross.
So now that our biased co-host got that out of their system, the the Mega Drive had a lot of announcements. It was a big thing that they were pushing since it was, it just came out the year before, and they really wanted to hit the ground running. They had announcements like arcade ports of stuff like Altered Beast, original things like the Alex Kidd
I
games.
was about to say this
Um,
was the important thing to note for people who don't know is this was Sega Genesis, but it was pre-Sonic Sega Genesis.
yes.
So they're two big things. Rather than pushing like that cool Nintendo attitude with like Sonic and Vector Man and Echo and stuff, they were like, our system can do like perfect arcade conversions, and they wanted to push Alex Kidd as their mascot. Which, the whole Alex Kidd thing arguably did not work out, but those arcade ports, those were a big selling point for Sega at this point.
Yeah, they were. And you had games like Altered Beast, like Golden Axe. You also had games that were based off of arcade games, but they made their own. Things like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, which plays very different from the arcade game. You also had RPGs with Phantasy Star 2 coming out. So they had all of these different things that they were talking about coming out in 1990 that they were pushing. They also had Herzog's Way, which a lot of people don't know about, but it's like a
Spy.
weird Zwei. Am I German? No. Um,
Spy.
Herzog's Wii. It it's like this weird proto MOBA. It's an interesting game, and it's the type of stuff that I liked Sega for. But a lot of the big things like Super Monaco GP and like we said, Alex Kidd, those were announced, those were coming out. Sega was really trying to push that difference between them and Nintendo while they could. And one of my favorite games for the system had a huge section at the show. It was Thunder Force 3. I'm a huge bullet hell shoot 'em up or shmup if you want to say that fan. So Thunder Force 3 is one of the big ones. Beautiful soundtrack. There's a joke going around the community sometimes that people just play the games to listen to the music half the time.
I mean, I get it. Those soundtracks are amazing. Also,
They're
do you remember
very
when we
good.
could just call them shooters and it didn't confuse people?
Yeah, and people understood what we meant instead of thinking, "Oh, you mean Call of Duty?" No,
Yeah. Like, yeah, now we have to be specific. We're like, horizontal 2D side scrolling shooter.
top-down shooters. Unless you're playing Ikaruga and you decide to flip the television to make it. You remember that
Oh
was
my
a
god,
big
that's
marketing
clever. I
thing?
did not know. Like, I played the crap out of that on my Dreamcast, and I
Yeah, no,
I
that was a
never.
big marketing thing. Is people were like moving their CRT ass fucking televisions and
I
flipping them so it would be left to right instead of up and down.
I wonder if that's healthy for a television set.
It's probably not.
Yeah. That's I gotta go and research that after this. But yeah, it was Thunder Force 3 you were talking about, and I mean,
Yes.
in general, it was a pretty decent year for that kind of game. There was a lot of genres yet that didn't exist or were still in their infancy. So kind of older genres like shmups and sports and platformers were still like center stage. Even RPGs and JRPGs, like you said, this is the year Final Fantasy was, announced for North America, and Fantasy
Mhm.
Star 2 was coming out. So it was still early in JRPGs. They weren't dominant on systems yet. Like the 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 market share for genres looked way different than it would just a few years later.
Absolutely. And that's pretty much what we are, at least what I know about CES in the winter. I don't really want to go over summer right now because that's near the end of the year. But if you have any information
It's
about,
so weird that, like, I'm sorry, the seasons weird me out because it's like I think of winter as coming at the end of the year and summer in the middle of the year. So these distinctions confuse me.
yeah, no, it's because for them, winter is in January and summer is, when did they do it? Like June or July?
Yeah, the thing I have up doesn't even say.
Yeah, but it's, oh yeah, it was in June 1990.
So yeah, yeah, we don't have to keep talking about that one.
Hmm.
It was just it was a big year. Some big stuff happens in the summer, but it was a big year for like hardware transition. So there's some interesting hardware and peripherals that'll come out, and I'm not sure if they were all announced at CES or not. I know some of the smaller ones were not. Some interesting things like this was a big year for the Game Boy,
Hmm.
um, which da 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 da.
Da da da.
Okay, sorry, I was looking. Yeah, it was apparently shown off at Winter CES 1990. So yeah, the Game Boy, which again, you had all these. uh, higher tech devices, like for handhelds. I didn't even mention them. This was you had the at various points in the year you would have the Game Boy, the Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, and the Turbo Express, um, PC Engine Express, whatever you want to call it. And it's interesting how like dominant, it's old news, but the Game Boy like smashed all its competition and sold more than most of the consoles that existed in this time.
Yes.
And it is, such a simple, outdated piece of tech even at the moment. So
Mhm.
it's fun, but yeah, a lot of those peripherals, the ones that weren't announced at CES that I was just going to bring up real quick, were
Yeah.
Game Boy peripherals. Like famously, if you ever played with an original Game Boy or Game Boy Pocket or Game Boy Color, you know that they did not have a backlight.
Mhm.
So this was the first year a lot of third parties would release add-on, you know, Game Boy Light things, which were not like the cool worm lights that you'd see for Game Boy Color. Instead, they were these bulky monstrosity clip-on things that like hung off the front of the screen of your Game Boy
I
and
know. I
made it
had one of them. They
weird.
were great.
Yeah, though this was a big year for those because
Mhm.
obviously people were getting Game Boys, and it was like, hey, you want to play Tetris in the dark? You can't. But here's a light so you can.
So I actually want to bring up, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that are coming out and the ebb and flow of systems, things like the NES starting to sunset. But I want to bring up a casualty. Speaking of peripherals, the mighty, the wonderful, the bad, the Power Glove got discontinued in the year 1990. I
Didn't it come
mean,
out in 1989?
in October,
It lasted less than a year. That's harsh.
the Power Glove did not do well. Originally manufactured in Japan with by PAX, Mattel did the manufacturing in the U.S. And it started off at, and this is 1990 money, mind you, or 1989 money, 75 US dollars,
Mm, and it,
which
I'm,
including for inflation is like 155.
and as anyone who has ever messed with one or done the tiniest bit of research on one, they aren't very good at what they do. Uh,
No, they're
the
not.
technology behind them was really cool, and the guys who made it ended up like the technology went on to do other cool stuff outside of video games. Um, but yeah, it uh, was not very good.
It was not. There were two video games that came out with um, moves you could only do with the Power Glove. By the way, it was Super Glove Ball and Bad Street Brawler, both which you could play without the Power Glove. However, there were specific moves you could only do by utilizing the Power Glove.
Mm. Yeah, the Power Glove is most famous for I think its inclusion in the movie The Wizard,
Yes.
which uses it in weird, inaccurate ways to make it look cooler than it is.
The way that he was moving the car and it's beautiful. The Wizard also brought up Super Mario Brothers 3, which was another way it was announced over here. Speaking of,
Huge game, like people. It was the giant dominant AAA game of its day. It was the Elden Ring of its day.
it's the Elden Ring, yeah. And while The Wizard was 1989, it was December 15th, 1989. So I'm claiming that as a 1990s property.
If we ever
And
go back and do 1989, we're going to be like, damn it, we already did the Wizard.
we already ruined The Wizard. No, it was essentially a giant Nintendo advertisement. And it showed things like Double Dragon and the Power Glove, Mario Brothers 3. And I actually kind of want to. I'm not going to go into the movie proper because we have a lot to talk about. So I want to actually use that to jump into it. Since we're talking about things that 1989 we're talking about coming out, why don't we go over some of the hardware that was out? We already talked about the Game Boy a little bit. You brought up the Genesis, but what about it made it special? Why were people so excited? Because that came out in '89, but '90s where it really started to push itself.
Well, I mean, we
So
we kind of talked about the fact that the NES was the dominant piece of hardware in the market at this point, and it's 8-bit and it's pretty long in tooth at this point. whereas the Genesis, or the Mega Drive, was 16 bits and featured made up things like blast processing. Um,
What
but
do you
no,
mean
it
that was
was
totally real?
16 bit. It had like a really good Yamaha sound chip. Um, and it like NES had a lot of arcade ports, but they were weird, uh, altered, inferior. Not always inferior, but many times, like if you wanted to play an arcade game at home and you bought the NES version, you would be like, "This is not what I play in the arcade at all." Uh,
Yeah,
whereas with
bubble bobble at home.
Yeah,
Yes.
whereas with the Mega Drive or Genesis, it was like you got these, and it was the first time you could be like, "Man, I want to play Mortal Kombat at home. Oh, look, I can play Mortal Kombat at home." That was not 1990, but just as an
Yeah,
example,
yeah.
like it was a big deal for that. And obviously Sega did some great advertising, and it was pretty easy considering it was like, look at these NES games. Now look at our Sega Genesis games. Um, and I mentioned another 16-bit console, which was the TurboGrafx 16, which uh, has some interesting hardware stuff about it that
Mhm.
puts it in this weird area between 8-bit and 16-bit. But regardless, it also looked way better than the NES, but it never really put a significant dent in the North American market.
Which is a shame because it had some really awesome games, and the soundtracks were always better on it.
It did. In
Uh,
fact, it had
so
a CD add-on that I mentioned, the Turbo Graphics CD, or if you're in Japan, these are all the PC Engine. And because it had a CD add-on, it could have CD quality audio, which is why, like, if you look at some of the things that won awards this year, like best soundtrack for most publications goes to like a TurboGrafx 16 game, something like Ease
yeah,
1 and 2.
I was gonna say a very specific Turbo Graphics game won that almost
Yeah,
universally.
Wise 1 and 2. No,
Yes.
I cannot imagine anyone ever saw that in the store and just guessed the way it's pronounced the first time.
I always said YS until somebody said it was East, and I was like, oh, okay. Um, but yeah, it's just a little bit about the hardware. Not too. We're not doing a huge dive into it. What we're really here that I'm excited about is going over the software that came out at that time. Now,
Yeah, we
this
might
is
do a more hardware specific episode at a later date, because
right.
I'm really into the hardware, but again, it's kind of dry to sit here and be like, and this super cool chipset, you um, like this could display this many colors, and this had a resolution of this, and that was groundbreaking. Um, Not as exciting as being like, yeah, Sega had Spider-Man versus the Kingpin, and that was freaking awesome.
They also had Buster Douglas's boxing. It was
Oh
great.
god, poor
The
Buster
best.
Douglas.
Yeah, poor Buster Douglas. But yeah, so let's go ahead and roll into that. We're not going to go in chronological order. We're going to just go more on
And the
what
reason for that is
came out.
not because we're cool and casual. It's because we didn't do enough research to have a chronological table.
I thought about doing that, and I felt like that really wouldn't be worth it, honestly.
It would be a lot of work, and we would end
Yeah,
up missing something because there's a lot of weird. I mean, there's the main hardware that we've already mentioned, pretty much
yeah,
all of it. There were a couple other things, but there were a lot of peripherals. Like this is the year,
yeah.
for example. I'm sure you were about to bring it up at some point, but the Game Genie came out
Yep.
this year. From Comerica, and prompted lawsuits from Nintendo. A lot of lawsuits from Nintendo in this time frame.
That hasn't changed all that much, to be perfectly fair.
Yeah,
Uh,
Comerica won that lawsuit though, which is
they
why you
did.
saw Game Genies and Game Sharks and stuff come after
Mhm.
that.
Absolutely. And how do game genies work? What do they do?
Oh yeah, I guess some people might not know what a Game Genie is.
Mhm.
It's a cart that your cart goes into, a cartridge that your cartridge goes into, kind of like the Sega Tower of Power or whatever.
Yeah, or
And
Sonic and Knuckles, you know.
it allows like temporary I don't. I did a bunch of research on this like a long time ago, but
Mhm.
it allows like temporary editing of the code in a game,
Yeah.
which people would simplistically, it's like this is used to do cheat codes for games, like change the number of lives you have or give yourself power ups, etc. But it actually had a lot wider capability than that. You could do all sorts of interesting things, like mess around with like the sprites in video games or backgrounds, or basically you can alter any sort of value in a game, which of course means you can also break the game, but it was only temporary, so then you just had to reset.
Yeah, exactly. Like what the Game Genie really did is it looked into the memory of your cartridge. And it allowed you to mess with the hex code and things and change that memory coding in there. So like for example, the memory would say you Mario has 3 lives. You could put in a string and that string would change that code to say Mario has 99 lives, right? And that's how the Game Genie kind of did its magic, quote unquote, right? Your
So it basically
wishes.
gave you the Konami code, but in every video game.
Exactly. And like you said, it got used to do a lot of really cool ROM hacks and like some of the earlier ideas for what a ROM hack was and changing things up in homebrew. I guess they were called homebrews back in the day.
Yeah,
They
because it was. Oh, go ahead.
they used that as kind of like a stepping off point to get into things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say they shared, because the thing is, you would input these, like you said, hex codes, long strings of numbers, um, and people would share them. I'm sure at first just with each other, but eventually they would show up in magazines, and there would even be magazines just devoted to these codes, because this was pre internet dominance. So you would get uh, a magazine or whatever with this string of codes, and you would put the codes in your game genie, and bam, you would get whatever it told you,
Mhm.
was for. So it was a cool, like you said, kind of an early ROM hack type thing, kind of similar to the way back in the day for older like computers, magazines would send out free games or software as like a code that you had to a programming code that you just input and compiled on your little home computer. Um, so pretty cool stuff, and that was the first year for that.
Yeah, it's excellent. And it eventually laid way to the action replay and various other things. But we could probably actually just do a whole episode on Game Genie and the
We
legacy.
could, and I just wanted to mention one more thing about it real
Mhm.
quick,
Of course.
semi related in that it's just the same company. While researching for this, I discovered that Comerica and some company called BDL were making two other peripherals for Nintendo. One was a portable NES, so it would be similar to like a Game Boy but bulkier, and it would just play NES games. Uh, and then the other one was a Game Boy to NES adapter, which just looked like an NES cart that you could slide a Game Boy game into and then put in your NES and play it, like a Super Game Boy but for the NES. Both these were apparently prototyped this year, and they were shown off in magazines and things like that. But then Nintendo, gave them a cease and desist, and it was successful. So these never went beyond the prototype stage, and they are like not. I looked around on YouTube because I follow a lot of channels that cover obscure hardware, and like nobody talks about these things, and I found that surprising. But it so I just wanted to bring that up because it's something that not a lot of people apparently have heard of, but there was many years before like the Super Game Boy, or it's not like we ever got a portable NES. Um, these things were apparently prototyped, and according to the reviewers that got to see them, the journalists that got to see them, they worked really well. So that's a shame that those never came out.
That is a shame, but Nintendo gonna Nintendo. They're gonna protect their stuff as much as they can.
True.
I and so
You
also,
think they would have taken the if you could play NES game or Game Boy games on an NES via an adapter like that, you'd think Nintendo would just take the idea, but that's not how Nintendo works.
no, it's not. That's more how Sega works.
They don't want you to. They didn't want you playing your Game Boy games on your NES. They wanted you playing your Game Boy games on your Game Boy. Damn it!
Yeah, exactly. Even though I think the Sega way of doing it is probably better because it makes you look better in the public eye before you totally screw over the company and not pay them. But
Are we
that's
talking about the guys who made Sonic Mania?
absolutely that is what I am talking about. But that's for another day. Today we have no Sonic here. We have Alex Kidd. So
God,
going into the things that came out in uh in 1990, let's have a little bit of a discussion before we go into what won awards for that year. We have a list of games here that we want to talk about.
I'm sorry. I just want to say real quick that
Yeah,
whoever at Sega was like, Alice Kidd will rival Mario. Like, I don't know how they were that out of touch with the rest of humanity, but like, Alex Kidd's not cool. Like,
I
doesn't
don't
look
know.
cool, doesn't have a cool name. The games, some of them aren't that bad. Um,
Maybe they listened to some too much Hall and Oates back in the day and we're out of
I
touch.
guess I'm just like
Yeah.
you're like our answer to Nintendo's cool plumber is a lame kid. Like just a kid. I get maybe they were like this kid is so generic that every kid could be this kid, so it's like a self-insert type thing, but
Yeah,
that's
kids
not
like
what you
that.
want in a mascot. Like,
They did well. They eventually kind of retouched the idea with Kid Chameleon, which was like an adult version
dude, I
almost.
loved Kid Chameleon, even though I've revisited it and it is not as good as I remember it being, but
It's really not. I played it as a kid, and I'm like, I could turn into a samurai and shit. This is great. And then I played it
exactly.
as an adult, and I'm like, ooh.
Yeah, yeah, that's I actually used that name when I was around that time, not around that time, but a few years later. I'd go to laser tag place because that's what you did in the middle to late '90s, and it was cool. But anyway, you had to pick a name, and I would pick Kid Chameleon because I thought it sounded cool.
Yeah,
Fun,
that's not a bad name for laser tag either. So there you go.
fun Brian factoid for the day.
Yeah. Another
Okay, so
fun Brian factoid is they really like this game called Dragon Spirit.
I was about to say, let's get into the games. No, there's a few games. Okay, so this is a big year, and it's
It
probably
is
because it is the year that I got my NES. Is a big year for games that my favorite NES games. Many of them came out this year. Um, Dragon Spirit, which we have talked about on this podcast before, was a port of an arcade shooter, which is one of the most heavy metal shooters because you are a dragon.
yes.
Um, and I won't go. We've talked about it before, and I could do a whole podcast on just Dragon Spirit because I freaking love it. But great game. Other games that are on the Hey Brian's favorite NES games that came out, Captain Skyhawk, which is another weird isometric shooter. I had you play it on stream one time, and I remember you didn't make it that far, and that's because this game is kind of hard.
Kind of. That game is ridiculous. It's an isometric shooter with traps that pop out that aren't their hitbox is a little longer than it actually is, which is even more difficult because it's isometric. So you're trying to like dodge stuff and just getting blown up. I went back and beat the first level just to prove I could to myself. It, it's a
Yeah,
fun game though. Like it
it
looks great.
it has some cool
Yeah.
ideas, like the you can even kind of see some influence it might have had on Star Fox later,
Hmm.
because the way the levels are laid out, where it's a linear level with a semi-linear level where you're forced to proceed forward, and there are the occasional branching paths. But then at the end you'll get to a boss, and once you get to the boss, you're playing, opens its wings, and you are then no longer forced forward. You are fighting the boss in like a space where you can move forward and backward and left and
Yeah.
right, kind of the way Star Fox works, where you go into the level and then you get to the boss and it's all range mode or whatever, and you can fly
In
around.
Star Fox 64, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Star Fox 64. I'm
Hmm.
sorry. For those people who, stan Super Nintendo Star Fox. Um, but that was a big one that came out that year that I loved. Published by Milton Bradley or whatever, the
Hmm.
game board game company. Which is also weird. No, solstice.
Solstice, yeah.
Okay, so I say solstice. I brought this up in a previous episode, but that's just I got that game that year, and
Mhm.
no one told me how to pronounce it. So when I was learning to talk, because I was still pretty young, I that's just what I thought it was, solstice.
Yeah, no, that makes
Um,
sense.
so I still that slips out sometimes. But another weird isometric puzzle game that we won't get into, but has amazing music.
Yeah, I wonder who did the music in that game.
Yeah, I wonder.
I wonder if there's a whole episode that we did based around that composer.
There's, dude. There's so much good music this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And speaking of some really good music, I'm going to cut in a little bit here.
I was gonna say, give us some of your takes here.
Yeah, yeah. So we're going to start off with a game that wasn't good. And if you see in our notes, I have a lull next to the name here.
Ah,
And Street Fighter 2010 is a Nintendo Entertainment System video game with the name Street Fighter that is not attached to it in the way you might think. You play Ken far in the future of the year 2010
hey,
in
you just don't like
space.
what they did with your hero, okay? You're just
Um,
you don't like the end of his story, but that is what it is, man.
it is. You're in space fighting a bunch of aliens with a really bad fighting system with a punch that kind of reaches far, but not far enough to hit them before their hitbox hits you. And
It's a platformer, right?
it's a platforming action game with very bad controls. I was very
And
sad when I played it.
in the story, like Ken became like a scientist or something, and
Yeah,
then yeah, it was. Wasn't this like not a Street Fighter game before it was a Street Fighter game?
yeah. I think they got the name thrown on it, but it is. So the whole idea is that it wasn't really that Ken was a scientist. He had cybernetic implants put on him after winning the United States martial arts championship.
As happens, that's what we do with our martial arts champions. We cybernetic them up.
Now that's a Capcom USA exclusive, though. In the original, you play Kevin. They
Ah,
attached Ken's name to try and attach it to Street Fighter back in the day.
they did that with a lot of stuff back in the day. I
Yeah,
mean, they did it with movies too, but they'd be like, this is kind of like this thing, or this character looks kind of like this character. Let's just attach it to this brand.
yeah. I it was not great. The game wasn't wonderful. The whole storyline of Ken getting implants after giving up martial arts after winning a tournament but getting back in the game because his friend died is just not spectacular. It was probably one of the worst games of the year. Soundtrack was very good though.
I would
Um,
love it if like Capcom, and maybe they've done this at some point. I don't know. I feel like Capcom does not recognize that game at all. Um, but it'd be cool if they had like alternate costume for Ken that was like his 2010 outfit, like cybernetic Ken in Street Fighter 6.
yeah, no, absolutely. That'd actually be pretty cool. But somebody that's connected to another game on the list is Junko Tamiya, who is the composer, which is the only good thing about Street Fighter 2010 was that it eventually ended and that the soundtrack was good. And that composer also made music for Little Nemo the Dream Master, which is a game that also came out in 1990. This was when Capcom was kicking the shit out of it with their tie-in games.
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't that an anime or something?
Yeah, so Dream Master was weird, where Little Nemo was kind of like a multi property thing where they kind of made it all at the same time.
Ah,
So they made Adventures in Slumberland, which was the movie that came out, and then they made the game that kind of tied into it. It was all a plan, if I remember correctly. I might be remembering a little incorrectly, but it was kind of a thing where they wanted to enter the US market and they thought Nemo would be a good way to do that. And they also kind of put it together and released it along like with the video game and stuff like that. Because it came out, jeez, what was it? 1981 is when they started wanting to work on it. And that we could get into Nemo. Nemo's actually interesting enough to have its own damn episode, to be completely honest.
I will need to
But
do some research first. I have very little Nemo experience.
Yeah, but in Japan the movie came out in 89 and in the US it came out in 92, whereas the game came out before the movie, so they did some tie-in stuff. There's a lot there. It's an interesting property. Um but then the last one that I want to talk to before I hand it back over to you to talk about a couple things is we also got stuff that's a little lesser known. I want to talk about Chrysalis actually.
I was gonna say, isn't that like you've talked about that game a lot? You like it. No one else remembers it.
So I played it last year and I loved it. That's why, because I played it recently. And
It's an RPG, right?
yeah, it's a top-down RPG that has Zelda DNA for sure. You swing your sword like you do in Legend of Zelda. You have health points, magic points, experience points, multiple elements of swords, which is like the whole plot line. Is you're trying to power up your sword with the different elements as you're going along. It's a really cool like role-playing adventure game. And it kind of got thrown under the radar because SNK made this adventure game that nobody talked about because it just looked like Zelda, right?
Hmm.
But it was actually pretty awesome.
I mean, yeah, like because of you, I've it's on my list of things to go back and check out.
Mhm.
Um, Other things on this list, by the way, most of these that we've talked about, actually, I think all of them was Little Nemo. That was a NES game.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so these have all been NES games. Okay, so Destiny of the Emperor was another one that I don't
Mhm.
have any experience with that you put on this list.
Yeah, Destiny the Emperor is a role-playing game for the NES that follows our favorite shoe emperor, Liu Bei. Um made by Capcom actually.
By our favorite
Um
shoe emperor, do you mean the only one Westerners know?
your point's not wrong. Yeah, no. So the whole idea is it follows Liu Bei when they're fighting the Yellow Turban rebels. And so the way it works is eventually it follows them as they go through and showing Liu Bei's rise to power of the Shu Kingdom.
So this is like
Mhm.
a video game based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms before Koei dominated that niche
Yeah, and it came out in 1989 in Japan and 1990 in the US.
and was promptly ignored or forgotten, I assume.
Yeah, it had a lot of fun things that it tried to mess around with. Like you can have up to 70 characters in your party that you can switch in and out and do different battle tactics and
Okay,
things.
that's super cool.
Yeah, and it was pretty fun. Um, as far as like the reception, pretty much a lot of people think that it is interesting. It does some cool things and it doesn't get mentioned very often.
Huh. That's a
And
shame.
most people that play it think it's great. And in my experience, like if we look at the Wikipedia page, it says stuff like Jeremy Parrish praises interesting and adorable, suggesting people check it out while noting it's an oft mentioned class that it is not an oft mentioned classic.
Oh my
So
god, the Jeremy
basically,
Parrish,
the Jeremy Parrish.
inventor of Castle or Metroidvanias.
And yes. You know, and you have like RPG gamers saying that the game was really good, even though if the story didn't interest them when they were a kid. Stuff like that. Everybody like, yeah, the game's really good, and people don't talk about it. And I'm glad you brought that up because it is a game that I think people should look into. The problem is that it does never been re-released, so the only way you can play it is on the NES or emulation.
Sad. Well, in a parallel reality, you could also play it on the Camerica's portable NES.
Yes.
Um,
you, you
but
did talk about how we have a bunch of NES titles. Let's Sega it up.
no,
Let's.
wait, I had one more
Oh,
NES. Well,
okay,
just
okay.
a quick mention. So Fire Emblem came out this year. We should at
It
least mention
did
that.
in Japan.
Yeah,
Yes.
in Japan, Fire Emblem came out this year for the NES, and uh, sort of set the foundation for what would eventually become like the modern TRPG genre. Um, we were talking about parity earlier with like different release windows for Japan and America, and you brought up that Street Fighter 2010 was just radically different in both
Yeah.
places. But An extreme example of that kind of nonsense is Metal Gear 2, which I just wanted to mention real quick.
Oh yeah, no. Before we get into that, can we pause real fast?
Can we pause real fast? No,
Yes.
hold your pee. Yes, we
Oh,
can pause.
oh, Jesus Christ! Please don't make me do that.
All right, now that Shannon's back from their bathroom break, we will jump right into the weird thing that you would never see happen today is that Metal Gear, not Metal Gear Solid, but Metal Gear was a big game for the NES and for the MSX, which we might talk about in the next episode when we talk about like Japanese computers and things like that, because it's kind of more computer than it is console. Um, but it was a big deal. So, it was going to get a sequel. Um, and Japan got a cool, Metal Gear sequel. And America got like a completely different one called Snake's Revenge, which is bad. Is a
It's not
bad video
good.
game. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is not a good video game. It is not recognized as canon. It is not claimed by, Kojima, the creator of the franchise or whatever. It's this weird thing where they were like, we don't want to. I forget all the reasons, but they were like, we're gonna make one that's specifically for the North American market, and it was just fucking awful. And it's like, the real Metal Gear 2 is a good game, so y'all would have been much better off just localizing that. But I guess y'all knew better. Um, yeah. So yeah, but that's just an example of how back then the market was totally different. Japan was, the dominant player in home video games, and there was that weird just difference where, like, again, we were getting like Final Fantasy this year. What year did that come out in Japan?
What, Final Fantasy One?
Yeah,
I think it was 89.
was it? Because I know in some of these cases,
No, it
maybe
was
it was.
87. I'm wrong. It was 87.
Yeah, that's a 3-year gap. Like, two depending on your math, but it's a huge. Can you imagine if it was like, say, like something like Elden Ring? It was like, all right, this cool Elden Ring game's in Japan and it's awesome. We'll get it over to America in like 2025.
Hey.
you know, you know, like hell no. Like, um, and I mean, there are a lot of reasons it was like that. And at the time it was kind of justifiable, but it was so weird compared to now. And that was just normal. And it wasn't just video games that were like that. Anime was like that too. America tended to be watching anime that was like 10 years old. Um, but anyway, that's just the last thing I kind of wanted to say about the NES. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about the NES for 1990, and we may get to it at some point. Maybe even more in this episode. I don't know, but we should probably move on to like the other platforms.
Yeah, so before we head into the Genesis, which is the other major one, let's take a quick detour and let's talk a little bit about the handheld games. We talked about the Game Boy a little bit. So why not talk about some games that are on there?
What, the Game Boy had games?
Oh my
I thought it was
goodness.
just Tetris, right?
Well, staying in that realm, we've got Dr. Mario that came out, which was a little weird to play because you could only have like 2 or 3 colors because it was the Game Boy. So matching the colors for the pills was interesting.
Yeah, and just so nobody ats us, by the way, the Game Boy did technically release the year before this.
Mhm.
It released in July of 1989 in America. But
These games
this
came
was
out in
its.
1990, though.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is its first big year in America, first full year. Um, but yeah, it was already a big deal by the time this rolls around. But yes, you were saying Dr. Mario
Yeah, Dr. Mario. It was hard to play because of the colors,
because
or
of the color.
or
Oh God,
lack there
what were they?
of.
Just different shades of gray
Yeah,
or green, whatever.
it was like the did like 1 or 2 colors. There was some like messing with the patterns to make them fit a little bit better.
Oh,
So
that sounds awful.
it was playable, wasn't too bad. It was a lot better in my Super Game Boy, I'll tell you that. But
I can imagine. I mean, I played of these games, so I did have access to a Game Boy at the time, but I think I pretty much exclusively like the only memories I really have on my OG Game Boy are Tetris, and then later on like Final Fantasy Legend and stuff. But that was later on. I don't really have any significant memories of Game Boy games from 1990. I did want to mention there was a Godzilla game
ooh, so
because
let's talk about it.
should we? I don't know anything about it.
All right, never mind. We can move on.
I mean, I can pull it up real quick. That's people love that, right? Whenever podcast hosts are just researching stuff on the fly.
Well, while you're looking up stuff
I I only
for
knew it was around because I saw an
nice.
advertisement for it when I was doing research for this, and I do remember that the advertisement was like, it has 65 levels, and you're out to save your son, Manila, and he is hidden in one of the 65 levels, and I'm like, he can stay hidden. Like, I don't want to save him.
Oh,
Manila
no,
sucks, okay,
Manila
but
does suck.
I'm looking, and yes, this was actually, it's a port of an MSX game.
Oh, there you go.
So yeah, and it was released by Compile, who is a famous developer of some cool games from back then. A lot of which, though, stayed in Japan. And it uses it's all Showa era designs for people who know Godzilla, which I know is your favorite era. So maybe it's a 2D side scrolling video game with Showa era characters made by Compile, and maybe you should check
Perfect.
that out.
I should check that out. I do love
The
Compile. I liked Spriggan so much. Oh,
apparently the uh Ifugabe, however you say his name, Akira, the guy who does the Godzilla music for the movies, apparently he did at least the one song for this thing.
there
Um,
you go. All right.
but yeah, Godzilla game that we probably spent way more time talking about than deserved it.
Hey, well, one of the other games on the Game Boy that came out in 1990, it was one of my favorites as a child. And it was actually called Balloon Kid, which was a direct sequel to Balloon Fight. Did Balloon Fight need a sequel? No.
I mean, more Balloon Fight would have been cool. I like
But
Balloon Fight.
Balloon Fight's great. Balloon Kid, you're Alice who uses balloons to go travel around. The idea is to go from the left to the right in collecting balloons left by Jim, who I think was the main character in the first game
How odd.
or something like that. Oh, no, it was an unarmed balloon fight because Balloon Fight was basically just joust. So they took this joust game and made a plot line where you're your sister, you're this girl trying to find her brother, and you're flying around trying to pop balloons of other things and not get your balloons popped. And it
So I'm
was
gonna make
fairly
this
fun.
I'm going to make this relevant to current events. You see, this is the week where the
Oh
U.S. shot
no,
down a Chinese spy balloon. So, and then, yeah, they could make a new version of this game where you're an F-22 shooting down balloons.
they could, or you could try to be a balloon dodging the F-22. That would be
Someone
more
on
in
the
line.
internet needs to make a ROM hack immediately
Oh geez.
where balloon fight is F-22s and Chinese spy balloons.
So moving on from that, let's go to Gargoyles Quest. Yay, Gargoyles
I
Quest.
own this game.
Oh man,
I
I love Gargoyles Quest. It
I
was it's good.
I have the Japanese card. I got this like last year or something. I shared it on the Discord. I have played through it and I liked it. Just and also, all the praise, any praise that Shannon here is laying on Game Boy games is all insincere because
Oh
last
my
year
god.
he told me that he in fact thinks the original Game Boy is a piece of shit and that it does not need to be remembered.
Okay, so those words that I used were not that. And also, any words that I used like that were to make fun of Brian.
So mean.
The game. What I was saying is that the Game Boy did, stuff for its time, but there's almost no reason to go back to play Game Boy games right now.
So mean.
Anyhow, now that he's done being a petty Betty,
Yeah, I
move
had to get it out
on.
there.
Yeah, did you? Did you really? Did you have
I
to?
did.
Uh-huh.
I did Othello, and oh god, this one actually did come up. We should probably mention this game. Just mention it at least.
Yeah,
I'm gonna butcher this name, even though I've heard it said a million times. But it's
sure.
Hey Onkyo Alien or whatever.
Hmm.
I feel like you don't know what I'm talking about. We mentioned Jeremy Parrish earlier. He's the reason I know this game because he's talked about it. But
Oh, hey,
Heyonkyo
Onkyo
Alien.
Alien. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was
Bigger.
apparently a Game Boy game
Yeah.
for 1990. Nemesis, which is another Game Boy cart I own, which is a Konami shooter
Hmm.
in the Gradius franchise.
There you go.
Um, there was actually okay. So I'm looking at the list of Game Boy games, on the fly because
Hmm.
that's definitely how we should do things.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of Game Boy games released this year. Of course, many of these were in Japan, but there were a lot.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
because the Game Boy was really hitting a stride, really.
I said that I didn't have any significant memories or experiences, but I was wrong because Final Fantasy Legend 2 did come out in 1990.
Hmm.
So yes, I do have a special relationship with a 1990 Game Boy game, and that is Final Fantasy Legend 2.
Excellent. A lot of people consider that the best one in the original three Saga games, and I can understand why. It's very
it's
good.
that's another going back to the weird Japan America differences. Final Fantasy Legend 2 is actually Saga 2 in Japan, not part of the Final Fantasy franchise, but they were like, no one in America knows what the hell Saga is.
Well, it was made kind of to be an offshoot of Final Fantasy. It was a weird thing.
But so they were just like, let's call it Final Fantasy Legend, just like Final Fantasy Adventure is Mana.
Yes,
Um,
that is the first Mana game. Senkin
and
Densetsu.
now when they re-release these, they use their proper names, which is kind of not confusing, but I imagine there's got to be somebody who's like, I wish they would bring back like Final Fantasy Legend and Final Fantasy Adventure, and it's like they did. they, they're just not called that.
Just go play
Um,
Saga Frontier. You'll be fine.
yeah,
Um,
Clax.
Quacks.
Clax came out in 1990. Another big one. So people often like to talk about how movie tie-in games or licensed games were
Mhm.
garbage until a certain point when they stopped being garbage. That's actually not necessarily true. Uh, there was a period kind of in the middle where they were garbage. But back in this time, they were not necessarily garbage. And an example of that is Gremlins 2,
Mhm.
which was a game for the Game Boy and the NES, which was like Game of the Year contender.
Yeah, a lot of people really loved Gremlins too.
Yeah,
Specifically the
it's
NES version, if I remember.
yeah, and another the Disney licensed games like the Disney afternoon games. Chip and Dale came out this year.
I mean, yeah, but Capcom made those. It doesn't count.
Oh, they just don't count. Yeah, they also had Castle of Illusion, which was on our list. Um,
Yeah,
so
Capcom's really good at making platformers, and almost all of those are platformers. It's pretty cool, actually. The
uh,
biggest one was probably DuckTales whenever that came out, right? That's probably the most famous of them.
yeah, probably. I mean, it's oh my god, that soundtrack. But DuckTales definitely gets the most attention, and it's gotten the most like they've all gotten remakes at this point, I think, right? In that like Disney Afternoon collection. But the DuckTales remake was the first and was really, really good.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
absolutely. And the Game Boy had a lot of good stuff that was out at the time. But I do want to transition to another console unless you have anything you want to go over again real quick.
was just gonna say, apparently, also Dragon Slayer got its Game Boy port this year, which was a big deal because it's one of the one of the progenitors of the JRPG genre. Um,
Absolutely.
I don't think the Game Boy version is particularly good. Like if I was trying to get someone to play the first Dragon Slayer, I wouldn't be like, "Yeah, man, pick up Game Boy." Um, but it's cool that it was there. I never played any RPGs on the OG Game Boy. Not because I was avoiding them, but it was just I was very young and didn't really understand different genres and what I wanted.
Yeah, no, the Game Boy is actually what kind of got me into RPGs with Saga One.
I've heard
Um,
some people really, I played, like I said, Final Fantasy Legend, but I didn't know what an RPG was really. I was like 4 or 5 by the time I was playing that like heavily. And I a 5-year-old doesn't know like action adventure versus RPG versus whatever. Um, they just like someone put this game in my hand and I really enjoy it.
There you go.
But anyway, you wanted to transition. Are we transitioning to the Genesis or to the Turbo Graphics? What
The
are we doing?
Turbo Graphics, or in Japan, the PC Engine.
We really should just call it the PC Engine because the Turbo Graphics, despite having some cool what is it cachet with Americans because it was this niche thing,
Mhm.
it was arguably a failure here.
There's not a
So
lot of arguing.
yeah.
It failed.
So whereas the PC Engine was a pretty big success in Japan, so
Yeah, and that's part of what made it sad. And part of why I wanted to speak about it is we talked about soundtracks, we talked about RPGs, progenitors of the series. We got to bring up Ys, right?
he's
So,
the bumper car game starring some redheaded dude.
Adol, bumper Adol going vroom vroom, ramming into people. Yeah, so Ys 1 and 2 was a collection of the first two games that they released on the PC Engine CD or the TurboGrafx CD.
Which was the first. People love to talk about the Sega CD as like CD add-ons, but the this came first and was because of its success in Japan was probably the most successful CD add-on for anything.
Yeah, pretty much. And people like to talk about things like Lunar being the first game that had like anime cutscenes and stuff, but I'm over here waving my arms at the PC Engine screaming. That
People like to put Japanese games from this time period, like if stuff wasn't localized or if it wasn't localized till later or if it just has fan translations, people love to just pretend it's not relevant. So they'll you could be like, look at all these TurboGrafx 16 games, or look at all these MSX or PC 88 games, and they're just like, yeah, but those weren't localized in America officially, so they do not count.
Yeah, boohoo. And also, like, it's such a pain. That's We complain about stuff like that all the time, so I don't want to take too much time to tell people that they're super incorrect and I hate them.
Well, I love
But
what their logic will be like. Well, because I didn't play it, and I'm like, did you play all the games released in America?
yeah,
Did you play? You know, again, did you play all the games released in America? So, why are those relevant? Like, if you're going to make that distinction, it should be that no game only games you personally played count.
yeah, no, that's part of what I don't like about that argument is I agree with you 100% on that. Um, but yeah, East 1 and 2 came out. They good video games. I'm pretty sure they got released in the US
They did that
in
yeah, yeah,
1990, right? Yeah, in 1990.
yeah,
They
and
came out
they
and did fairly well.
I was gonna say I mentioned it previously, but because of their CD audio, I mean, also the compositions are good, but
Yes.
because of the CD audio, a lot of publications gave them soundtrack of the year, and some publications gave it role playing game of the year.
Yeah, which I think is fair both ways.
Which,
And
just as I pointed this out in our
Mhm.
Discord not long ago, to current like JRPG fans and weebs and whatnot, that means E's Book 1 and 2 beat Final Fantasy for role playing game of the year, which uh, you know, is justified because if you look at the two games side by side, you're like, of course. But it's kind of funny that this incredibly what is now a niche franchise in E's defeated what
Mhm.
would be the king of all JRPGs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually really like East 1 and 2. A lot of people say they don't hold up, but I think the bumper car combat's pretty cool and it's a very simple save the world story that I think hits pretty well.
I mean, people like to shit on the bumper car combat and say it's simplistic or whatever, which I mean, by modern standards,
It
yeah, but
is, yeah.
compared at the time, being like, well, it's simplistic. And I'm like, compared to what? Like Final Fantasy? Why? Because you have a menu where you can select, like, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, these kind of turn based games. It's, I'm not saying they're not deep and I love them, but the menus and the turn based nature of them kind of create the illusion of complexity when it's
Right.
not really there. They're actually not much more complex. It's like you're having to press 3 buttons to attack instead of walk into something. That doesn't make it deeper.
Yeah, no, that's 100% on the nose in my opinion. And transferring from that to talk about a couple other games that came out in the US here in 1990, we have Splatterhouse, which was an arcade darling that got a TurboGrafx port that a lot of people consider very good.
That's the game that if so I it got lots of magazine attention, and I remember every
Mm-hmm.
time I would see it I just thought it was freaking Friday the 13th because the main character,
That's why
famously.
they changed his mask in the TurboGrafx version to look different.
Yeah, because they were gonna get a lawsuit, right?
Yeah.
Because he
Uh,
basically just looks like Jason, except for he's a good guy and a protagonist or whatever. But
he looks like Jason. Yeah, you control Rick, who's been cursed by this mask, so he can become strong enough to go rescue his girlfriend from this
very
haunted
bloody,
mansion.
gory looking
Very
game.
bloody game.
Yeah,
It's beautiful. It looks great. The sprites are gorgeous. The backgrounds are wonderful and lively, and there's blood and guts everywhere as you're punching, shooting, and baseball batting your way through. It's a damn good time, and I feel like more people should play Splatterhouse. I think
more people
it's a
should,
good
and not
experience.
the not the most recent. I say most recent, but it's been like 10 or 15 years. But
Yeah,
the
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 360,
reboot, yeah,
which wasn't nearly as bad as people said it was, but
it wasn't, but it ends on a cliffhanger and never got a
yeah. So it's just
sequel.
like the original games. We're fine. Um,
Yeah. So,
and
like you're saying, though, I was just gonna say, like, not a whole lot came out in America of
yeah,
significance for that year.
yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely. The only other one that I was going to talk about was Ninja Spirit, which is a very simple left, right. You're a ninja, murder stuff, get to the end of the level, but it's very fast. You have very high jump speed and jump height, which leads to really fast, exciting traversal.
Makes sense.
And then,
The all right, go ahead.
oh yeah, and then to finish it off, a game that came out in Japan only in 1990 called Cyber Knight, which came out on the PC Engine, and it's a mech RPG where you and go in with your characters and go into your knights and try to strengthen them up, and then you go around the world and help the aliens and try to push back an evil alien threat, and then
Help the good
find a way to
aliens
get
versus the evil aliens. Gotcha.
yes, and try to find a way to get back to Earth because you've been stranded. It's a really cool sci-fi RPG that almost
It
nobody
sounds like it.
talks about because it never got a release over here.
There's a lot of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate. I was just gonna say real quick before we move on from NEC, which is the company that makes the PC Engine and
Mm-hmm.
TurboGrafx. They did have another big piece of news this year that was hardware related, and that's I mentioned it earlier, but this was the year that they you know shut off their handheld, the Turbo Express, which is just a it played the Hue cards, the cards from the same games that you would put in your TurboGrafx or PC Engine. It was just a portable version of that, kind of like a Sega Nomad,
Mm-hmm.
but for that hardware, and it got a lot of attention. Like it won a lot of accolades, and magazines were all over this thing. But it was an expensive uh, portable version of a console that was already niche. So it just did not do anything in North America. I've always wanted one. I've played with them in person at like classic game fests and stuff like that, but they are expensive, but they are super cool. Um, but that was a new thing that came out this year, and again, it was a Game Boy competitor that just didn't even compete well enough for Game Boy to acknowledge its presence. Uh,
Absolutely. That's kind of the problem in that time period is Nintendo had such a foothold on so many things.
well, it was everybody
Yeah.
talks about it like it was the fact that Game Boy was cheap
Mm-hmm.
and its competitors were not. Game Boy would use a couple of batteries and last a decent amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Its competitors were not. Like you could, yeah, your Turbo Graphics, or I mean your Turbo Express or your Game Gear had cool colored screens and stuff, but
And they
if you were
lasted
going on
20
a road,
minutes.
yeah, I was gonna say if you're going on a road trip, they lasted like half an hour, and then you were bored. Whereas your Game Boy would last the entire thing. And also Game Boy had more recognizable franchises for like Western parents who were not gamers. They were like, oh, I've heard of Mario or whatever. So obviously that smashed. I just wanted to mention real quick because we have a listener who had one of these systems and talks about it. Another piece of hardware this year is the Atari Lynx, which is another Game Boy competitor, giant of a handheld.
Very
Um,
large, yeah.
yeah, but it did some cool stuff. And it actually, one of its games got a lot of attention this year and accolades, which was Blue Lightning, which was a cool. Wasn't that the helicopter shooter?
Yeah, Blue Lightning was the helicopter shooter, and
Yeah, it got a lot of attention. I know it was one of the games used to kind of try to sell the Atari in places like, or the links in places like Toys R Us and stuff. But unfortunately, like with the rest of these, it didn't. I think the most successful competitor was the Game Gear, and that didn't, win the market.
yeah, the Lynx came out in '89, and then they released the Lynx 2 in '91, right? Yeah,
I think so, which was
and
the smaller.
smaller, better battery life.
Yeah, it's just funny. These companies, I can imagine they're thinking, they're just like, this. Look at this Game Boy, this piece of crap. Like we can easily outdo that, like with technology, which makes sense because that's kind of how the home console market worked, or the computer market. It was like, I have the better technology, my stuff looks better, it'll sell. But in handhelds, people were just looking for something different. So,
Yeah, and like in
but
the with the Atari Lynx, it came out at like $170, right? The US. And you compare that to the Game Boy, which came out at what, $88? 89?
yeah, something like that, just sub 100 price. Imagine that. Like that is a great selling price. Imagine if like a new Nintendo handheld or something comes out at like 89.99. That is amazing.
Yeah, and if you look at the lifespan of the Game Boy compared to any other handheld, it 19 years, I think, isn't it? Or wait, no, 1989 to 2003.
I was gonna say, if you're, yeah, that line like all the way up to what, like the Game Boy,
Game Boy Color?
yeah, like yeah, some of those other, yeah, and then you had peripheral spin-offs like the Super Game Boy and stuff, and it just, yeah, like that. Obviously, Game Boy could get its whole own series of episodes, but
Yeah, sorry,
yeah, this
14
was
years. It was a 14-year long handheld console life. Like,
like
that's wild.
that is. Moving on from that, like just I'm looking at a list of some of the highlights of the year, basically, and I know you wanted to mention some of these. Like, big game of the year was the home port of Strider.
Yeah, Strider was a big home port. And I
EGM gave
actually,
it game of the year.
it did. And I actually wanted to talk about that. So, another thing that we had planned was we were going to do the EGM awards for the year, but we're already running a little long.
So yeah, see, this is why, listeners, uh, I'm like, we should do. Maybe we should pose this to listeners. The
Yeah,
two that give us feedback.
hell yeah.
Uh, So we were originally going to do one episode per year, and
Hmm.
then we were like, we'll split 90 into two at least, because there's a lot. And then it's like, we could do more than two. So should we do longer episodes, or so that we can do fewer per year, or should we stick to about an hour and then end up possibly doing a few episodes per year?
Yeah. So basically comes down to, do we want to do weekly? Do we want to do twice a month? How do we want to do it? Um do we want to do very large episodes? I think this one we're going to keep to an hour and have this question, or a little over, and have the question posed to y'all. Come back, we'll go over the awards that multiple games got, talk about what people consider the best games of the year, and
So
then
yeah,
talk
so
a
next
little
up.
bit, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and then talk a little bit about hardware, a little bit more, and a little bit more about the Japanese and PC scene, and then
Oh no, see, I demanded that those get their own episode. I have so much to say about the Japanese PCs.
okay, we can do 3 episodes on 1990.
Yeah, and then we also got to do an episode about 1990 video game music, and
No, 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 no. That being said, we
Hey, let's
appreciate
see what the listeners
everybody.
say. Okay.
Let's see what the listeners say. We appreciate everybody tuning in, and we will hope you have a wonderful day. We're going to be signing off. Brian, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, all the places. As Brian with an I, C Nerd, all one word, and you'll find me in all those places. Um, yeah, I'm not doing much. I've mentioned it last episode. I have an Etsy store which is listed under Madio Bros, but I think you can find that if you go to my Twitter. Um, what about you? You do more stuff on the internet than I do.
Yeah, I do streaming, which I haven't been as consistent with, but that'll be coming when the work season becomes less busy.
Yeah, you haven't been
Um,
taking my suggestions for games either.
Listen, the fact that I take any of your suggestions means you should be very proud of yourself. Okay,
Hmm.
I I stream mostly Metroidvania, RPG, and retro stuff. It's Teeps the Great on Twitch, and my Twitter is the same thing. It is Teeps the Great, and that's pretty much where you can find me.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess that's we'll see you next time.
Absolutely, have a good one.
Later.